Now let's turn to our event tonight. We are very excited to present 3 leading Christian thinkers on technology to you tonight to offer perspective on social media and technology more broadly. With this discussion centered around the Netflix hit documentary, The Social Dilemma, watched over 38 million times in the first month of its release, this docudrama has unearthed a wide discussion about the virtues and demerits of social media. Today's event is aimed toward respectful and constructive dialogue in pursuit of a much needed Christian perspective on social media. It is now my distinct honor to introduce our panelists of the night. First, Taylor Barkley serves as Program Officer for Technology and Innovation at the Charles Koch Institute, where he works on technology policy and research at the intersection of culture, technology, and innovation. Previously, he has worked as the Government Affairs Manager at the Competitive Enterprise Institute and as the Assistant Director of Outreach for Technology Policy at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Barkley describes himself as a Christian tech optimist, as co-authored Call to Freedom, Why You Can Be a Christian and Libertarian. Second, Dr. Derek Sherman is a professor of computer science at Calvin University and formerly taught at Redeemer University and Dordt University. Dr. Sherman is a leading Christian voice in the field of technology through his many publications, including a wide array of articles, book chapters, and his book, Shaping a Digital World, Faith, Culture, and Computer Technology. Dr. Sherman is a regular contributor to the Christian Scholars Review blog and a regular columnist for the Christian Courier. Finally, Dr. Sherman is a patented inventor and an enthusiastic user of the Raspberry Pi. Finally, Peter Menzies currently works as an advisor for tech companies on public policy and regulatory affairs. In addition, Menzies is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and a regular contributor on media and communications for Convivium Magazine, National Post, Toronto Star, and the Globe and Mail. In the past, Menzies has served as Vice Chairman of Telecommunications for the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission. Menzies was the publisher and editor-in-chief of one of Canada's major daily newspapers, the Calgary Herald. Finally, today's moderator is Nathan Visser, who is a third-year philosophy and theology major at Redeemer. Nathan is the head and co-founder of the Academy, and through his involvement with the club, he organized a massively successful discussion on evolution last year with an overall reach of over 30,000 viewers. I've had the personal privilege of getting to know Nathan as a prolific speaker and thinker who pursues truth with utmost humility and respect. So before I hand over the floor to Nathan and the panelists, I would like to say a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we want to dedicate the time that we have together tonight to you. We ask you for guidance as we seek truth and wisdom. Please bless our moderator and panelists with your peace to be able to guide us through this challenging topic together. We're also praying for open minds, open hearts, and ears to hear the things you want to say through and to the people you brought here. We pray that all in Jesus' name. Amen. Then I'm very happy to hand over the floor to Nathan and the panelists.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And yeah, I'd like to say welcome to our panelists, Taylor Barkley, Dr. Derek Sherman, and Peter Menzies. My name is Nathan Visser, and I am the head of the Academy Debate Club here at Redeemer University. If you've ever seen the Academy's previous event, you will notice that tonight's event is not quite structured as a typical debate. Since the ultimate goal of the Academy is to facilitate edifying discussion in a Christ-like manner, we decided to bring in 3 passionate and knowledgeable Christians with much experience in technology and communication. Tonight, each of our distinguished guests bring their own expert opinions on how we as Christians can navigate the complex world of social media. Our focal point for the evening will surround the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, which is a film released to expose the mechanics behind social media and warn the world just how powerful this technology is in our world today. The film casts this grim net over these rapid technological changes, and tonight we want to explore this message, and we want to ask, what is our Christian response? So this will be done via a series of question and answers. We will begin with specific questions from the moderator, myself, and after approximately 40 minutes, we will transition to answering questions from the audience. So for all of you listening tonight, I would encourage you to use the Zoom Q&A feature that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And at any point during the seminar, please type your questions into the Q&A feature. Send your questions at any point and we will begin answering them in approximately 40 minutes. So around 10 to 8. Keep that in mind. Keep thinking about them as we discuss. Without further ado, I will now ask our opening question. So to our panelists, what is the danger with social media? And for this question, I'd like to start with Taylor.
Thanks so much. Well, in short, my answer is it depends. It depends on what is meant by danger, the word danger, and the phrase social media. I also don't think that there are blanket dangers that can be ascribed to social media. So I guess to explain how I get to that point, I'd like for you to, if you remember only two things from what I have to say tonight, I'd like you to remember that humans have a history of fearful overreaction to new technologies. And I think the social dilemma is just the latest major example of one of the overreactions to new technologies. The second thing I will hope you remember is that studies about the effects of social media on society and individuals are ongoing, and the results don't match at all with the case presented in the social dilemma. Here and there are cross sections, points of evidence that do match, but the overwhelming outcomes of many of these studies don't coincide with the message that the documentary presents. So the two things, we overreact to new technologies and jump to hypothetical worst case scenarios, and the studies ongoing about the effects of social media don't back up what the message that the documentary presents. And in fact, in the documentary itself, there's a great example of the overreaction case. At about the 30-minute mark in the documentary, Tristan Harris, one of the co-founders of the Center for Humane Technology, looks square at the camera very seriously. And then he says, "No one freaked out about the bicycle." And he sort of laughs about it. No one freaked out about the bicycle. It wasn't going to destroy democracy. It wasn't spreading misinformation. When actually, that's not true at all. People did freak out about the bicycle. When it was brand new, people thought it would cause bicycle face. Literally a distortion of face, people's faces would get stretched because human beings are going far faster than they're designed to go. There were concerns about morality, lowered church attendance. Let me just read some of the examples from the New York Times in 1899. A headline, "The Morals of Wheel Women. A large number of our female bicyclists wear shorter dresses than the laws of morality and decency permit." And it ends with, "I most certainly consider the adoption of the bicycle by women as detrimental to the advancement of morality, nay, even its stability." And then another article ascribing lower church attendance to the bicycle. "The statement has been very freely made of late that not only people in general, but women in particular are not attending church to the extent or with the regularity that was the case some few years back." That was from 1896. And over again with each technology that we take for granted today, this overreaction occurred. The telegraph, people thought it was far too fast. Communication occurred way too quickly. Dinners were being interrupted by telegrams. Kind of reminds us of a situation now, maybe with smartphones or text messages. Some people said, who needs to know what's happening, 5 days compared to 5 minutes, what's happening in New York and New Orleans? What difference does it make? The telephone had its own fears. "Telephone error is a new malady to plague the public," said an article in 1929. And then another one in the New York Times in 1877 about the telephone. Says, "Nevertheless, the vast capabilities for mischief of the telephone and the real purpose of its unprincipled inventors have been studiously concealed, and it is only by accident that the greatness and imminence of the danger to which the public is exposed have suddenly been revealed." And we could go on with other examples about the elevator, teddy bears, the mirror. And I encourage you to check out accounts on Twitter like the Pessimist's Archive or the podcast Build for Tomorrow that looks more deeply at some of these case studies. So I think it's important to keep in mind that we have a history of overreacting to new technologies. The second point I brought up, studies. What are the studies out there? Recently I've heard of one that demonstrated people's capacity to change their habits with social media. The social dilemma makes us believe that we're stuck, our minds are being hijacked, we're stuck in decisions that we don't make. And actually, University of Regina there in Canada had a study that said, no, it's not at all the case. And the psychologist said the social dilemma presented zero evidence behind their claims of psychological manipulation. Another study I found very, very fascinating was by Amy Orban, who looked at statistical analysis for 350,000 adolescents and their well-being, what correlated with their well-being, including social media. And what they found was that eating potatoes was correlated with well-being to nearly the same degree as technology use, and wearing glasses even more so. So I guess I'm in big trouble with the glasses. I also find it interesting that books about polarization, division in America, such as Ezra Klein's Why Are We Polarized, Charles Murray's Coming Apart, and others, don't mention social media as the prime factor. It's one of many factors perhaps, but it's far and away from the top #1 factor. And the social dilemma presents it as the cause for unease the world over. So studies after studies, the more we learn, I think the less weight the claims of the social dilemma have. And I think you see that in the documentary itself, where Jonathan Haidt is the only one who presents data, and it lasts about 2 minutes. And finally, to wrap up quickly, I think all this is harmful for a few reasons. I think it promotes a learned helplessness, and it gives way more credit to social media companies than they deserve. And in fact, we have the power as individuals to make changes, to use these technologies as we see fit, to advocate in our own community on best practices, and to share, especially as Christians, a vision for a positive future and ways we can live our lives today. So that's how I would answer the question. I think dangers are way overwrought, and it depends on what you mean by those words.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your input. That's lots to take in. Dr. Sherman, how would you answer the question? What is the danger with social media?
Well, I think I'd take a slightly different tact. The social dilemma on Netflix begins basically by interviewing several engineers who had helped build the social media platforms themselves and who are now sounding the alarm about their creations. The impact of the film comes from hearing the very people who created the technology behind the social networks expressing regret and remorse for what they had built. The documentary provides a compelling explanation, I think, of the dangers, although in an entertaining way, and you could quibble with some of the details. But the truth is, the business models that are used continue to bring people back to the platform, and their attention gets fixated on screens as a result. Sophisticated tracking algorithms and profiling algorithms informed by behavioral science and machine learning are employed to keep users engaged, manipulating them unconsciously through positive intermittent behavior reinforcement, which is not unlike the dopamine effects to playing a slot machine. And of course, social scientists have been pointing these things out for years already. The film, I think one of the critiques of the film I have is that it appears that the engineers are discovering something new, whereas I think if you had read any social science literature in the last decade or more, you would have seen these concerns laid out already then. Anyways, the very design of these networks, the bias within these networks is to keep eyeballs on screens to attract advertisers. The business model has also been called surveillance capitalism, which is basically an economic system centered around the commodification of personal data, the core purpose of profit making. Now, the side effects is basically keeping users engaged, so time, but there's also documented declines in mental health, growing addictions that manifest themselves in symptoms such as spending time to the point that other activities suffer, feeling lost or unwell when disconnected. I know there's some debate about whether the actual DSM manual defines this as an addiction or not, but it's I think there are some similar symptoms that you can find in some of these behaviors. Although one can try to push back, social media algorithms tilt the floor, in the way the movie puts it, of human behavior in a way that's difficult to resist. The end result is greater polarization, outrage, misinformation. Basically, if you look at social media, you see some of the same effects and same principles and techniques that are used in propaganda. You know, Jacques Ellul's 3 principles of propaganda: keep it simple, repeat it often, have emotional appeal. And you know, you can see how this plays out in the increase in political disinformation campaigns, remarkable growth in extremist groups, and of course, as a Canadian living in the US, you know, I observed the presidential elections, and I think these things all have underscored this point. Sherry Turkle, who I think is a well-known social scientist, who's written several books, Alone Together, Second Self, Reclaiming Conversation, who's been at MIT for years, observes in her book Alone Together that we curate our lives online, projecting a second self, if you will, a curated fantasy of who we want to be. Another writer, Shane Hipps, compares virtual communities to cotton candy. He says it goes down easy and satiates our immediate hunger, but it doesn't provide much in the way of sustainable nutrition. Virtual communities can spoil our appetite, if you will, for participating in authentic community, which requires intimacy and proximity. Many years ago, the respected media ecologist Marshall McLuhan observed that while certain media and technologies promise to extend and enhance our reach, when you actually push them to their extreme, they sort of reverse and have the opposite effect. When it comes to social media, the promise, of course, is of enhanced and extended social connection. However, when pushed to an extreme, as some of us in, you know, lockdown with COVID have now had firsthand experience with, social media leaves you alone, you know, together with a glowing rectangle. So I have a philosophy colleague here at Calvin University named Jamie Smith, and he's written a number of books about how habits and rituals are like the liturgies that point our heart in a particular direction. The truth is that our digital devices foster habits, repeated habits, which over time have significant shaping implications and can influence our hearts. So I think, you know, in summary, technology is value laden. There is a bias that's built in. There's intentionality in terms of the features and design decisions that are made. The makers of technological objects embed their corporate values into them, and then users are therefore biased in particular ways. You know, the social networks have behavioral scientists and all kinds of other people being very deliberate with how these things are designed. And you can resist these biases, and there's ways to use social media in a good way, which I'll get into later perhaps. But as the documentary puts it, the floor is tilted, making it difficult. So the problem, I think, has 2 aspects. It's the intrinsic design decisions. And as a computer science professor at Calvin, this is one of the big things I try to hammer into my students, is that, you know, it's not just a technical product. When you're creating a digital platform, you're creating a social, an artifact that has social, cultural, political, economic, all kinds of other implications. You know, it's not just the technology product. And so that's one aspect. And then as a result of the design, how these things become used and misused, and sometimes in ways that their designers never even anticipated. So those are a few problems to start with that I would put before our listeners.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sherman, for your input. We'll go to our final panelists now. Peter, what would you say to the question of what is the danger with social media? I believe you're still muted there, Peter, if you wanted to.
That's the most frequent phrase I've heard this year. Technology is just a tool, and I mean, it can be manipulated. So in terms of the dangers, at a very high level, the dangers are, one is human behavior and people behaving badly, and one is addiction. I wasn't convinced by the social dilemma's argument that, you know, its purpose is to keep eyeballs on screens. Of course it is, but so was the purpose of a newspaper, was to keep people's eyeballs on their pages every day and to read as much as they could and to want to buy it again tomorrow. the purpose of radio has always been to attract audiences, keep keep people listening, keep people entertained. Television's purpose is very much to keep people's eyeballs on screens. So, I mean, some of those arguments I found very unconvincing because they're not new. The companies doing this, attempting to keep eyeballs on screens and keep you entertained and keep you engaged and that sort of stuff in order to make money. There's nothing new about that at all, right? People have been doing that for a very long time in terms of media. In terms of it being frightening, that's where I found myself in agreement with Taylor on that. New technological advancements always are frightening. They always cause disruption, and they always cause fear of the harm that could occur. You just need to go back to the beginning of radio, for instance, in Canada. It was unregulated at first. People were just consuming spectrum and broadcasting. One of the events that led to its regulation was the fact that Jehovah's Witnesses had launched a radio station and were saying terrible things about Roman Catholic bishops in Montreal, who then lobbied the government to say this has to stop. There's bad language being used and hurtful comments and hateful comments, etc. So, and that was 100 years ago, right? That was the early 1920s, right? Just where we are. And it's really the exact same argument, right? So, I mean, what that illustrates is people can behave badly when they get technology. They can behave in what you would call an unchristian fashion. The development of the printing press prior to the development of the internet was, I think, probably the most profound technological development in terms of communications in human history. And one of the first outcomes of the development of the printing press was somebody translating the Bible out of Latin and into German, where people could read it for themselves, right? So all of a sudden, people were reading the Bible for themselves and going, oh, hey, wait a second, that priest has been telling me it means this, and I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, yeah, I'm not sure it means that, right? And people began, I mean, I am not a Christian thinker. I am a Christian who thinks about communication, so that I stand to be corrected on many of these things. But all of a sudden, people began developing what they felt was a personal relationship with God rather than a relationship with the church and onto God in terms of that. And as we all know, that was extremely disruptive. There's a variety of views on it, but there's no question that wars were fought and blood was shed for a very long time over issues such as these. And a lot of it had to do with power as well. So, but that's not to say that there aren't problems. I think the algorithmic issue, the ability for people to be able to opt out of algorithms is important. Personally, I find it irritating on Facebook now because I get too much stuff that I agree with, right? I don't, but that said, people do like to go towards media that confirms their preconceptions of the world. But that occurred before social media as well, right? People who had a conservative view of the world liked to read conservative newspapers. People who had a more liberal, commonly called liberal view of the world, liked to read newspapers. Your favorite columnist, could be Naomi Klein, or your favorite columnist could be Rex Murphy. When I wrote a column for newspapers, I would have people who agreed with me would phone me up and tell me I was the smartest person they'd ever read. And boy, oh boy, just write some more because you're so smart, right? And I'm really that smart because they agreed with me. The people who disagreed with me would phone me up and say, I find it disgusting that somebody of your feeble intellect is allowed to publish a column in a major daily newspaper, right? So we've all always been attracted to that. So, but I think the important thing, so people will do that. People will read, their preferred newspaper might have been Christianity Today, or their preferred newspaper might have been the Jewish Free Press, or their preferred newspaper might be one founded in Islam or something like that. So they find these self-reinforcing viewpoints. I think the important thing for media is to give people the option to be exposed to ideas that challenge their preconceived notions of the world. And that'll be the challenge for social media going forward. I was just going to mention in terms of radio and that sort of stuff, there, one of the big events of the 1930s, I believe, was when Orson Welles broadcast War of the Worlds, right? And people were terrified by radio. I mean, the status quo, and this is what you'll get with new technology, the status quo will always be terrified by it. People in power, people in positions of influence will always be terrified by it because they can't control it at first, and anything can happen on there. So Orson Welles, I'm old enough to remember, many probably aren't, did a radio broadcast, a radio theater of the H.G. Wells novel War of the Worlds, in which Martians were invading, right? And people were tuning into it, and they believed it was happening as news. And people were running into the streets and panicking and for hours, right? Because they heard something that was theater and they thought it was real. And that was the power of radio at the time, because people were addicted to it and listening too much. And I'll just shut up now.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Peter, for your valuable insight. Yeah, I think that takes us really nicely into our next question here, because you all touched on it briefly, but I want to really hone in on one specific thing that you all alluded to. In the documentary, they raise the question of tools, right? And the question of, when it comes to technology, right? We view technology as a tool. But there was a lot of disagreement, and some even in the documentary, there was disagreement to if you would define the tool of social media in the same way as you would a tool like a wrench or a tool like a hammer. So my question is, would you consider social media a neutral tool or not? And I'd like to start off with Taylor again.
Oh man, what a big question. A neutral tool or not? That was the question.
Yeah, and you could leave it open too. Is it a neutral tool? How much, and how so?
So maybe this kind of gets to it depends, in answer to your initial question. What is the danger with social media? Because there are a bunch of different kinds of social medias. I think in critiques and discussions, we often jump to, the big ones: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, and maybe Snapchat, maybe TikTok now. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of other social media platforms, all with different purposes and communities, norms of behavior. And I think in thinking through that makes me more inclined to say, social media, if you just said that phrase to me, absent any knowledge or awareness of the big companies now, I would lean more towards neutral tool. I think at its essence, it's technology that connects people via the internet, digitally, and we could really drill down into like maybe a more generic definition. But I remember I ran into a representative from GitHub at a recent event talking about content moderation policy. And I was surprised because I never think of GitHub, the software sharing site, as a site that cares about content moderation, but they absolutely do. They have about 50 million users who show up and share software code. They chat, so they're concerned about this as well. You can look at Reddit and how they manage content and connect in specific rooms with specific interests. You can look at Wikipedia, especially as a kind of social media, maybe not in the sense of connecting profiles and setting ones up, but people are gathering around to share their thoughts on specific articles. So I think just and those are just the most prominent examples, and every single day sees something new crop up. We can, if we expand our definition even broad enough, we can talk about email as social media, and I think it's often left out of discussions about social media and its impacts. So I would, because of all that, I think I'd lean more towards the neutral tool, but it certainly can be imbued with value, as Dr. Sherman mentioned and he's written about. So you should go in with eyes wide open. You know, what is the community you're participating in? Why is it there? Why is everyone gathered around and using that tool?
Absolutely. Yeah, and Dr. Sherman, you have written a bit about this. So what would you say to the question, is social media a neutral tool?
I would say an even more radical statement. I would suggest that no tool is neutral. And since social media is another tool, it would fall into that same category. And I mean, this is a little bit confusing, I know, when I first mentioned this to my students too. And basically the notion that, tools are just neutral artifacts is sometimes referred to as technological instrumentalism, that it's just a neutral tool, that I guess in the US they would say, guns don't kill people, people kill people, right? So it's not the gun. But the world's a different place when you have lots of AK-47s around. And actually there's some compelling studies about, how guns change culture. And even a hammer changes things, right? Changes the world around it. And so when you think about neutrality, well, the automobile is a classic example, right? I mean, it's not just a tool to get from point A to point B. It changes the layout of cities. It changes where we live with respect to where we work and worship and so on. So whenever you look at a tool, you ask the questions, what does it make possible? What do we gain? And so that's, the thing with social media is there's clear advantages to how it, can open up our connections to all kinds of other people and ideas. But then the other question is, what does the device make harder to do, and what might we lose? And what is likely to happen when everybody adopts a certain technology? That can change things ecologically as well. And some of this stems from, some of the choices that engineers make. Neil Postman, years ago, decades ago, a famous media ecologist wrote, "Embedded in every tool is an ideological bias, a predisposition to construct the world as one thing rather than another, to value one thing over another, to amplify one sense or skill or attitude more loudly than another." And another media ecologist sort of summed it up, we shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. So there's all kinds of ways that tools change things. And I mean, we've mentioned some of the things about social media. I mean, just look at how politics has changed, celebrity, popular culture. I mean, if you just want to look at some of those things, I think it's clear that social media has not been neutral. So there's all kinds of, there's all kinds of ways in which social media is certainly not neutral, even though you need an agent using it in order for it to realize its potential in different ways. So I could go on about that, but I'll leave it at that.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Peter, would you like to weigh in on that question as well?
No, I don't think it's neutral.
Okay.
Social media is a tool, primarily because it's built to appeal to people's biases. Through the unrestrained use of algorithms. But that said, so are other media, right? I was recently writing something and polled some former journalists, and are newspapers, television news stations, are they more prone to report on bad news than good news? You look at that through, say COVID, right? Like, what are the headlines? Did the case count go down, or did the number of variants go from 2 to 6? Or 20 to 60 or something like that? They will always take if it bleeds, it leads. If newspapers never report when airplanes land safely approach, right? And they're entirely unapologetic about that. But it actually does shape people's opinions. When I worked in newspapers, we never reported on suicides, for instance, because it was known that it encouraged more. Right? That people would read that, and suddenly it legitimized in their minds suicide as an option to their problems. Right? Now they do all the time, unrestrained, without ever thinking, wow, every time I report on a suicide, is that somebody else going to commit suicide? Right? And the same with the bad news, or if a child is abducted, right? Child abduction is no bigger a problem, probably less of a problem. Crime is a problem, is less of a problem than it ever was before. But people live more fearful lives now than they did when crime rates were higher. They don't let their children go out and play on their own the way they did when I was a little boy. I mean, all my mother ever did was chase us out of the house, right? But all of a sudden, media has this impact on people's behavior. So kids don't leave the backyard. They don't go throw a baseball around in the diamond or go kick a ball around on the soccer pitch and that sort of stuff. So all of those things can happen. And the other problem with it, I would say, is tools can be, you can build a house with it, or you can hit somebody with a hammer, or you can hit somebody over the head with it. And that's why I think one of the takeaways I think from the film, from the documentary, is protect your children from this, right? Because there are bad people there. There are people who, like the happiest, biggest response I ever get to a Facebook post is when I put a picture of one of my grandchildren up. And all my old high school friends that I found through Facebook, who I'm delighted, there's an upside to this, right? My old college roommates and that sort of stuff, that's what people like, right? That's what it's for. But at the same time, if you're not careful, and particularly when you're at an impressionable age, people will be mean to you, right? And for people in the developmental stages of their lives and otherwise exposed emotionally, there are people out there who just like to beat people up, right? It's not like there have always been mean girls in high school, right? There all probably always will be, but you could avoid them. And sometimes on social media, you can't. So those are my thoughts.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Peter. And yeah, that actually does take me to another question. This one I'll direct at Taylor to start, because Taylor, you talked a little bit about this in your article. In the quote that I have here is, you wrote, "Rather than relying on politicians or even the companies to make changes, people should feel empowered to equip themselves to mitigate the harms they might encounter." So like Peter was saying, a particular area of concern for a lot of the people in the documentary, in our society, and especially in the church, is the impact that social media has on our youth, because they are not only more involved in social media, but often, as Peter was saying, more susceptible to the social media influence and to the harms that come with it. So my question for you, Taylor, is, can the church help equip our youth to mitigate these potential harms? If so, how?
Yes, that's a great question. And I think, Peter did bring up an important point about minors, people under 18 who use social media. So first, the church can absolutely be a resource. And there are resources out there. There's a growing list of resources. Just recently, Brent McCracken wrote a book. I think it's something pyramid about daily habits, akin to Jamie Smith's book, Habits of the Heart. Another great resource I've just read recently by Justin Whitmel Early, The Common Rule. And then for younger people in particular, Amy Crouch, Andy Crouch's daughter, wrote a book, My Tech-Wise Life, which is a riff on Andy Crouch's book, Tech-Wise Family. And I actually thought Amy Crouch's book was better than her father's book. And she's writing it to teenagers, college students in particular, applying the lessons that her dad talks about in Tech-Wise Family. And a lot of these are principles that you can find in other resources out there, like Nir Eyal's book, Indistractable, which I love the opening in the introduction. Nir Eyal, who I don't think is a Christian, certainly the book isn't coming from a Christian perspective, but many of the principles I think overlap with Christian principles. I love in the beginning, he says, "You are more powerful than any big tech company." So counter to the narrative of the social dilemma and other critics who would say, Center for Humane Technology have said this, free will is being destroyed. Tristan Harris in the documentary says, "Checkmate humanity." So Nir Eyal has these set of principles. And I think what I like there and overlaps so well with, I think, the message of Christianity is look to, if you do think you're overusing social media, if you have a problem with it, if it's distracting you, look inward. Like what is causing a discomfort for you to maybe go to the social media app or the website and causing overuse or what you might call compulsive behavior. And to address that problem, what's really going on in your heart and your mind. I think that overlaps so well with the Christian message, and then come up with tools to use it in ways that are helpful and not harmful. So, and there are other organizations out there specifically aimed at younger people. The Family Online Safety Institute is one great organization that has tools for parents and caregivers. And I think addressing parents and caregivers, grandparents included there, on how they can help their kids be safe online, that's a huge need as well. There's surveys out there that address, ask minors how many questions like how many of you had parameters about screen time use or what social media apps you can use, and it's at least half that said no, we don't have any rules or parameters. And I think it's very appropriate, like we do with other technologies, like the automobile. We don't let 8-year-olds drive cars on the street. After a while, we came up with norms of behavior and best practices that figured out, actually, it's best if drivers are above a certain age. And I think we're developing that right now. And we're still early days with social media technology, and that's often under discussed as well. So there are a lot of resources out there. I think there's a role for the church. The church is waking up to the role as well. And I think there's so much room for excellent tools and speaking and sharing best practices with each other. We're just at the start.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for those points. And yeah, to Dr. Sherman as well, you also wrote on the social dilemma. And the quote that I have from you here is, what the world of social media needs are more computer scientists, not trained just as hewers of code, but as thoughtful caretakers in the garden of digital possibilities. So when we're talking about the question of how do we help youth mitigate these harms that come from social media, how would you answer that question in light of what does a thoughtful caretaker look like in that context?
Yeah, so I mean, there's the two sides. There's the thoughtful user, and then there's the thoughtful developer. I mean, I can quickly sketch both. I think the Christian perspective basically is wonderful in that, when we look at the biblical story, we can see that, the kind of drive to connect socially and to interact with each other is a sort of a creational impulse. We're built for relationship. We're built in the image of God. So it's no surprise that we're drawn to tools like this. The possibility to build computers and networks is part of the potential in creation. We see that as something good. But yeah, the biblical story includes also the effects of sin, and we see how things can be distorted and perverted. The beginning of the film begins with the question, what is the problem? I think it's kind of fascinating. They're speechless. They're kind of like, they don't really know how to articulate it. And I mean, it may sound trite, but I mean, the big problem, of course, is sin, right? And that affects how things sort of play out at so many levels. And through a Christian lens, we see that, as sort of the problem behind all these other problems we're talking about. So I think what's neat about a Christian perspective is that we don't dismiss technological possibilities out of hand, even though they can be distorted in sinful ways. We need to exercise freedom and responsibility. So I think, as Christians, we can first of all be a good witness online in terms of how we do use it, right? So there's a wonderful quote from Václav Havel that I like to use. Václav Havel once wrote, "There's only one way to strive for decency, reason, responsibility, sincerity, civility, and tolerance, and that is decently, reasonably, responsibly, sincerely, civilly, and tolerantly." So I think there is a way that we can actually model and witness in our behavior online. Proverbs 15 verse 1 is a good reminder. A soft word turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. And I think in general, based on what I've seen in the US, just not talking about politics at all online is probably not the best medium for that kind of thing. And of course, social media can be used helpfully, right? Forming community when it's not possible. We're experiencing that right now. Encouraging and praying for people from afar. So I think there's lots of wonderful possibilities. I think Andy Crouch's book, I'll echo, if you're looking for practical sort of rhythms to commitments for your life to put technology in its place, this idea of having a rhythm of work and rest and Sabbath, waking up before your devices do, going to bed before your devices do, or the devices go to bed before you do, using screens for a deliberate purpose, showing up in person for the big events in life. He's got all these wonderful things. And Amy's book is wonderful too. I just was involved in a book review of that, and it was very favorable. So and then I think as far as the church has all this rich history of spiritual disciplines and practices that I think we've lost. Maybe not as much on the Catholic side, but on the Protestant side, the spiritual disciplines, prayer, solitude, silence, Sabbath, serving. These are ways of drawing your attention off of yourself and learning to live, away from the constant state of partial attention that your devices sometimes push you into. Albert Borgman, a philosopher of technology, talks about, focal practices, like meeting technology with deliberate counter practices of thoughtful things like cooking family meals together and gardening and hiking and so on, things that connect us widely and deeply. So I think we can be intentional about living our lives where it's not deterministic. We're not going to be, I disagree with those comments in The Social Dilemma as well. I think they're a little sensationalized, checkmate humanity. We always have responsibility. We always have the opportunity. It's not deterministic, it's not going to be a Terminator kind of ending. We have responsibility. But the implications for Christian computer scientists and designers, Jeffrey Hammerbacher once wrote, he was a social media pioneer, he lamented about how the best minds of my generation are thinking about how to make people click ads. And so I think, if we think of, our work in coding and so, with a little bit more zooming out a bit of the technical kind of tunnel vision and think about how can we promote flourishing, finding perhaps other types of business models. And some people have been exploring those. And then, getting help from people in the social sciences and humanities. I think this is something where the coders left to their own devices, literally and metaphorically, are probably not gonna be able to solve some of these problems. I think an example, this was mentioned actually, of a community that actually does things well online is GitHub. GitHub is a software development community, which is a place where programmers collaborate and work together. And I've seen some really wonderful stuff happen in that sort of setting. And I think as Christians, we're called to help shape those kinds of places and spaces online as well. And we need more Christian computer scientists, I think that there is some wonderful stuff, and maybe Peter knows more about this than I do, but Apple has decided to actually have humans curating the news that's fed on their platforms. So instead of allowing just the algorithms to kind of have their way, they've actually got real people who are thinking about, what should be running first? How do we balance the news? Now, everyone's got a bias. No one's neutral, but a good editor can throw out a lot of crap that would otherwise end up in front of people's eyes. And I think that's very, very promising for raising the caliber of social discourse. Some people have talked about establishing public social networks, removing the economic kind of side of things. And I think the open source model provides some ideas of how that might be able to be shaped. It's interesting. When you walk into a library, you see how people talk versus when people walk into a bar, how they're talking. The space actually sets sort of expectations about behavior, the shape and the design of the space. And so I think there's ways to do that and rethink how we create our online spaces. Yeah, and then finally, the U.S. perhaps people have talked about the fairness doctrine that used to be here in the United States that would sort of, and I don't like the idea of the government deciding what should run or not. Sorry, my lights, talk about technology, my lights are on a timer. But when it was revoked, that fairness doctrine, I think the news did change. I mean, it was not, maybe there are ways to think about how something like that might be able to shape, public discourse and the Filter Bubble Transparency Act. Some people have been proposing, forcing big tech companies to disclose, how these things are working and what your data is being used for. So I think there's some opportunities to talk about those sorts of things too, which could help shape the way online social networking companies deal with your data and the sort of things they can do with it. I mean, the European Union has already curtailed much more than what we find in North America. So in short, I think, just like Christians ought to be involved in urban planning and, politics and civil discourse, they need to be involved in this important cultural area too, trying to seek the public good. And there's a lot more that could be done. And we're hoping to train some computer scientists here. We actually have had some of our students go to Silicon Valley and work for some of the big tech companies. And I tell them, you're not going to be a Dilbert, be a Daniel in Babylon, right? Go there and help build a better world and pray for it while you're there too. So I think that, when you walk away from the social dilemma, you can be very negative about these sorts of things, but I think what it points to is the possibilities of how things could be much better and some of the things that we can do to improve our online discourse. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, thank you very much for that, Dr. Sherman. We'll move into our question and answer from the audience section here. And yeah, what you've been saying actually ties really well into this first question that we have from Aaron Plant. To what extent, and I'll actually float this question, we'll start with Peter, because Peter, you are someone with extensive experience in journalism and public policy as an advisor. And one of the things the social dilemma really emphasized a lot was the problem of misinformation and the problem of, social media has this capacity to spread information faster than before. So Aaron Plant's question is, to what extent should the government, as a policymaker, be involved in regulating social media?
Excuse me. There are areas that could be appropriate for government to regulate. I would say in giving, in privacy, for instance, data collection. Those are areas of concern where people get to guard their data, be able to opt in or opt out. You may, if I say on my Facebook page that, wow, I had a great round of golf today with my buddies, that doesn't go out there and you end up with a whole bunch of golf ads popping up from now on and that sort of stuff. You should be able to opt out or opt in. In terms of that, in the area of speech, the government being a judge of misinformation is, I think, a wrong. I think there are dangers to misinformation, but the government talks about that's a threat to democracy and that sort of stuff. My view is that the bigger threat to democracy is the government deciding what's wrong, or a government-appointed panel or anything like that. The CRTC, for instance, with licensed media. And licensed media in broadcasting is different because spectrum is a public resource, so it's handed out on a license basis, and it has certain conditions under the Broadcasting Act that says it must be of good standard, right? So there's an industry-led body called the Canadian Broadcasting Standard Councils, to which people can take complaints if they fail to get resolution with their the local radio station. One of the things Christians should consider on that was that it took a very long time for the CRTC to feel okay about there being any Christian broadcasting, because they felt it was contentious, going back to the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Catholic bishops, right? That people were going to offend each other, that, religion can rile people up. Look at the history of wars and all the horrible things religious people have done. It wasn't until roughly 1990, I can't remember the exact date, when, it's not that religion was allowed on TV on Sunday mornings. People could show a broadcast from the local church and that sort of stuff, but an explicitly Christian television station or radio station was only allowed at the time when the CRTC was deciding to license pornography. And they felt, well, we can't really leave religion out if we're going to license pornography, right? That would be to say to say pornography is okay and to say Christianity is not, is probably a bit of a stretch. it was a 7-6 vote by which Christian radio or Christian television was permitted to come in. So just keep that in context. These are the sort of things that can happen when the government decides what is disinformation and what is information, right? So I would rather, given that history and that context, I would rather the government restrict itself to the regulation of issues such as privacy, et cetera, in terms of that. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, democracy, let me put it this way, democracy is messy. It's often ugly. The thing with social media that's different from other media is it goes both ways. If you want to post on Twitter, praise the Lord, somebody's going to come back and say, look at this goof, they believe in the man in the sky, blah, 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 right? And you're going to get kicked around all over the place, right? So don't go on Twitter. but I mean, Christians have used technology. They've used, like I said from the beginning, they printed the Bible. They've used pamphlets. They've used it all the time. In the past year, how many people have only been able to go to church thanks to Zoom or you know, any other type of protocol? The internet, it can do wonderful things. But the government regulating what should and shouldn't be on there, what shouldn't be said, outside of the existing hate speech laws, which say you cannot shout out and say Presbyterians should be hit with sticks and harm should be done to them. That is hate speech. And there's a very high bar for the criminal code. And that's a matter for the police to manage right now. So that's my thought on that.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for that. Yeah, we have, again, a similar question from Miki, and I'll ask this one to Taylor. So should there be, if we're talking about censorship from the government and limits enforced by the government, should there be censorship and limits enforced by the social media companies themselves? We can start with Taylor if you'd have anything to say on that.
Censorship limits on the companies, so what rules prescribing?
Yeah, so I believe it's as in, like, in the case of something like Facebook, for example, should Facebook have the right to decide what content is allowed and what content is not allowed on their site? Gotcha.
It's a great question. And you know, here in the US and internationally, really, we're having this big debate about content moderation. I think intermediary liability is another way to say it. And I think an important principle to keep in mind is with all social media, we're talking about private companies. And essentially, you know, when I pop open Twitter, I'm using the software that they developed on a platform they developed, and computing power that they're either renting or bought. You know, they're using server farms probably to run the product. And it's easy to forget that this is a private entity. And I think as private entities, they have speech rights just like I do. You know, speaking as an American, you know, go free speech, and have every right to, you know, include or not include whoever they deem fit. And you know, we're seeing ramifications of certain decisions to have certain people on or off. You know, Donald Trump is a major example on, you know, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. So yeah, I think these companies are private entities, and we have to keep that in mind. And you know, it's a voluntary agreement, which kind of builds on, you know, a term that I've heard a few times tonight and happens frequently in social media discussions, this term surveillance capitalism. And the social dilemma falls victim to the same mistake as well, just assuming that it's all one-sided, that social media companies are extracting money and attention from us and we're getting nothing in return, when that's actually not at all the case. There have been multiple studies done of experiments offering money to people to give up Facebook, for instance, for a certain amount of time, and average value to give up Facebook for a year is $1,000, according to one study. There's, you know, tons of merit, because it's while we're not paying money, and it's non-priced, it's a non-priced transaction. So instead of, you know, $50 a month to use my Facebook account or my Twitter account, I'm giving them some attention and some insight into who I am so they can sell ads in return. And I'm getting some value from it, whether it's connection, entertainment, information, a thrill, whatever the case may be. And I think the term surveillance capitalism completely misunderstands what's going on. And I think that relates to my earlier point that these are private companies and I have a right to host content that they want to or not. And we see this all the time, and I think we appreciate it all the time with the major platforms. I'm not seeing the worst aspects of humanity and evil on the internet come across, say, my Twitter feed. There are filters, there are content moderators, you know, these articles about tens of thousands of people who have to look at that stuff that's flagged and cycle it away. And I think there's a huge need to look at those workers and how they're being impacted psychologically and even spiritually by having to moderate that content on our behalf. So we appreciate that aspect of censorship. So it's not just, you know, the most egregious things or the things we disagree with. So there are a lot of things that go into that question, but fundamentally they're private platforms that we get value from.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, thank you for your thoughts on that. I think we'll do one more question here. We have one from Joseph Nanda. The question here is, when we were discussing social media and how and its similarities to different technologies, is there anything that puts social media in a unique category in terms of fear? The all-encompassing nature of social media and computer technology. What makes social media unique, if anything, from other technologies, and what should be our response to that? And for this question, I think I'd like to start with Dr. Sherman.
So yeah, just to understand the question, there's something perhaps unique about social media because of its nature as opposed to other technologies. Am I understanding the question?
Yeah, so what about it makes it unique, and how should we navigate that?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, there's always been multinational corporations, but I think it's kind of unique to have corporations that have the amount of reach and scope and information that these corporations have, you know, and spanning the borders of countries and so on in ways that collecting information that goes far beyond the kind of detailed information that was ever able to be collected before. I think just the scale and the kind of tools that they're able to employ, where they're able to, you know, individually monitor and track. I mean, some of the machine learning stuff, we teach a course in machine learning here, and we have a new data science course that we've started. And some of the stuff that you could do is just unbelievably remarkable. These tools are very powerful, not just for, you know, classifying, but actually finding out new information. You know, they call it unsupervised learning in machine learning networks, you know, discovering new relationships and so on. And I think that's unique. It's the scale and the scope. Peter and Taylor both mentioned technologies in the past that have been that have created a lot of change and disruption. So that's not new. So I think also, you know, there's more and more critique now of the people who run these companies. I mean, one of the things that people used to say in Silicon Valley is you know, move quickly and break things, right? So it's also the pace of change. And when you have that kind of powerful technology at your disposal and you're moving quickly and breaking things, you know, there can be a lot of disruption. So I think a lot of those things come together just to make the scope and scale much larger than it was before. That's what comes to mind.
All right, absolutely.
Could I just jump in on that for a second?
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, I think that, I mean, the really fundamentally different thing is that it goes both ways, right? Traditional media is somebody creates something and you absorb it, right? You read a newspaper, you listen to the radio, you watch TV, right? This goes both ways. And it sort of goes back to your earlier question about how do you empower yourselves? And I think because it's new, we're still learning the protocols, we're still figuring these things out. And it's kind of fun, especially if you're a young kid. You get on Twitter and you have followers, you know, it's like, wow, I have followers, you know, like who else in history has followers, right? I mean, the terminology and wow, Kim Kardashian just liked my tweet, right? I mean, all these sorts of things where you get drawn, your ego just gets drawn into it. But the biggest thing to empower yourself is manage the room. Understand where you are. When somebody asks to be your Facebook friend, you don't have to say yes. You don't know this guy. You don't know this woman. Just say no. Like, keep your group small. Keep it family and friends if you want. If you want to make it, but do it with purpose, right? And understand it. Because otherwise, when you go into social media, it's like walking into a biker bar and not understanding who you're surrounded by, and then shouting out, "I hate bikers," right? Bad things are going to happen to you, right? If you do things like that. Or it'd be like, walking into any type of building. It'd be like a person walking into a Sikh temple and not taking your shoes off, right? I mean, you can do things that you don't know are offensive, but that are, right? And that sort of stuff. So, like, be aware of your surroundings, read the room, right? It's not just a post, right? Understand who's listening, understand how you will be heard, not just how you hear yourself. I think those are the most empowering things people can do, and people will be teaching their children as we learn how to behave ourselves with these new tools.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Peter, for those thoughts. Yeah, we're coming close to the end of our time now. So what we'll do is we'll just have our concluding remarks from each one of our panelists. So just very briefly, in under a minute, around a minute, if we could just talk, if there's anything else you feel like you missed, anything else you want to say. Specifically, the question I'll float is a general one. How should we as Christians engage with social media? Specifically, what should we embrace and what should we avoid? And we'll start with Taylor.
Yeah, this is an excellent question. And I think it's important to keep in mind that technology and innovation have improved quality of life and alleviated human suffering since day one, especially over the last 200 years, when technological rates and innovation rates have increased exponentially. I'm living a very different life than my ancestors did 300 years ago. And as Christians, I think that's worth celebrating. And as Dr. Sherman and other Christian authors have pointed out in their work, this is ingrained into who God made us to be, as little mini creators made in his image, creating things out of the material he's put before us. And as I was preparing for this panel, I was thinking about God the Father, I think looking with delight at some of the things that we come up with out of sand, for crying out loud. And asteroids are drifting by worth quintillions of dollars in minerals. When we get those, like what's he? Oh, that's so cool. I like to picture the Father with that delight. And when approaching social media or other emerging technologies, as Christians, we don't have to have a spirit of fear or timidity. We've been empowered by the Holy Spirit. Our future is secure in Christ. What do we have to lose? We can approach things with wisdom and care and pay attention to our neighbors and their needs, especially those who are minorities, who are forgotten, disabled, people without a voice. And like Peter said, we're dealing with other human beings on social media. So being kind, approaching them with an attitude of love. And so many of the tools I think that are provided in scripture in our Christian tradition are really that's the discomfort in all these discussions and critiques and fears about emerging technologies. I think that that's the core of it, and it's nothing new. And I think this is why Christ came to earth, died, and rose again. And that's a message that we as Christians have to offer the world.
Absolutely. And Dr. Sherman, very briefly, what should we embrace? What should we avoid?
Yeah, I think as Christians, we just need to be very conscious of the kind of witness we are online. I had an experience just a couple of weeks ago. I posted a question on a neo-Calvinist Facebook group, which you'd think would be filled with thoughtful Christians and academics and eggheads and very, very somber, dour people. And it was a simple question, but it actually got out of hand pretty quickly. And so I think having the wisdom to know there are some things that you shouldn't be talking about online because it's just not the right medium to have certain types of discussions. being a good witness, remembering that whatever is good, whatever is lovely, whatever is pure, think about these things and write about those kinds of things, and using it, as a witness. We're called to be a witness to the world, and I think that extends into the sort of social media spaces that we inhabit as well. And then finally, just very quickly, just monitoring our own social media habits. I think, as mentioned already, the books by Andy and Amy Crouch are good practical guides to bring into your life if you're having struggles with time management with devices. Another wonderful book is something called The Common Rule. It's an IVP book, and I think these sorts of practices that we can recover, these sort of spiritual disciplines and practices, will be really, really helpful countermeasures to the kinds of tugs and pulls and nudges that our devices constantly bombard us with. So yeah, I think I would just end it with that.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And last but not least, Peter.
Yeah, I just throw in, just be the best person you can be, right? As you would in your daily life, and avoid temptation. And the biggest temptation that happens with social media is the quick draw response. In terms of that, be thoughtful, be careful, manage your relationships. Don't, just like having a family dinner, you might not want to talk about religion and politics after the prayer. That sort of stuff, depending who's in the room. Avoid those sorts of things. And I think just respond with kindness, even if people are being mean to you, right? And that's the most disarming thing, is to listen to people respectfully, even if they're being disrespectful, and just come back with, hey, I guess we disagree, brother, love you. And that's it, right? It works. So that's pretty much it.
Can I quickly add one more thing, really, really quickly? Just the importance of embodied community, right? I'm going to give some people a really big hug once this COVID season is over. And I think, just enjoying physical embodied community again. And I think this whole sort of season of COVID has been a good reminder about how, social media can be better than nothing, but it's not better than something. In terms of embodied community. So thank you for inviting me.
No, thank you very much. And yeah, that's really a good representation of what the Academy is about, facilitating that conversation, like Peter said, and facilitating that community. So yeah, I want to thank you all of our panelists, for showing up here. This was great to have, great conversation, lots of great thoughts that we had here today. To conclude this panel, I am going to hand it over to my friend and associate, Samuel Vandeput, to close us out here.
Thanks. Nice job.
Yeah. Thank you, Nathan. And so this brings us to the end of the event. And before we part our ways, I want to specifically thank the American Enterprise Institute for their help in organizing this event. We also want to thank all of you for attending, and we hope it was meaningful. To me, it definitely was. And finally, we also want to thank Nathan for moderating, and we want to thank our amazing panelists, Taylor, Derek, Dr. Sherman, and Peter. So thank you so much. And for your information, if you would like to rewatch this event or share it with your friends, family, and whoever else, this will be posted on YouTube next week, so stay tuned for that. And we want to thank you all for attending this event and forming some sort of community tonight in the midst of COVID. So thank you so much, and God bless you as you go from here.